Welcome to this explainer. We're diving right into how a totally ordinary 2002 flight from Beijing to Busan ended up caught in one of aviation's most tragic geographic traps. Today, we're deconstructing Air China Flight 129 to uncover the hidden mechanics behind this disaster. I want you to put yourself directly inside the cockpit at literally the most terrifying moment imaginable. Picture this: through a churning, dense mass of rain and gray clouds, a solid wall of mountain rock just suddenly appears right in the windshield. The co-pilot is screaming, "No, I can't see out! Must go around! Pull up! Pull up!" And the captain? He's hauling that control column back with everything he's got, desperately trying to force a heavy jet into a roaring climb. So, that brings us to the central mystery we're looking at today. How exactly did a completely routine landing devolve so fast? Well, as you're gonna see, it wasn't just one massive, catastrophic failure. Instead, it was this cascade of small, overlapping errors. We're talking unexpected weather, slight miscommunications, and honestly, just the unforgiving laws of physics all combining to create an invisible trap for three highly qualified pilots. To really understand this trap, we gotta rewind to earlier that morning. It's April 15th, 2002. And the scene on the ground in Beijing, it's entirely calm. You've got a Boeing 767 with 40,000 hours of safe flight history just pushing back from Terminal 2. On board, there are 155 passengers and 11 crew members, all just settling in for what should be a short, completely routine trip across the Yellow Sea to Gimhae International Airport in Busan, South Korea. Now let's take a look at the experience levels in that cockpit, because it's pretty revealing. Captain Woo Sin-Lu was deeply experienced. We're talking over 6,200 hours specifically on the Boeing 767. But sitting right beside him, First Officer Gimhae had actually just qualified for his role about 7 weeks prior. In fact, this was literally only his third flight as a first officer on this specific aircraft type. So while he definitely had total flight hours under his belt, his actual time on the 767 was just a fraction of the captain's. And you know, that creates a bit of a hidden vulnerability when the pressure inevitably starts to rise. And that pressure? Well, it kicked off with a crackly radio transmission. As they were crossing the Yellow Sea, the very first signs of trouble started with this really hard-to-hear weather broadcast. At first, they couldn't even make it out, but finally, by 10:57 a.m., they get the automated report. And the news isn't great. Gimhae was experiencing some seriously deteriorating conditions. We're talking rain, mist, low clouds sitting at just 1,000 feet, and, this is absolutely crucial, a steady wind blowing right in from the south. That southern wind changed absolutely everything. See, the crew had originally planned for a nice, simple, guided straight-in landing. They were going to use runway 36 left, basically riding an invisible radio beam right down to the tarmac. Easy, right? But because of that new tailwind, they were suddenly reassigned to runway 18 right. And the catch? That runway has zero instrument guidance. So to solve this wind problem, air traffic control assigned them a highly demanding visual approach. Okay, so they were assigned what's called a circling approach. And let me tell you, this is one of the most intense maneuvers you can do in commercial aviation. It's like a giant puzzle. They had to fly toward the original runway using their instruments, but then at the last minute, break away visually, fly this low loop right beneath the clouds around the airport, and land on the opposite end. And there is an absolute golden rule here. If that runway vanishes into the clouds for even a single second, you're done. The pilots have to immediately abort the landing and climb away. No exceptions. But there was this massive fine print danger buried in the plan. The crew briefed to fly this low visual loop at an altitude of just 700 feet. The problem? A Boeing 767 flying faster than 140 knots is officially classified as a Category D aircraft. Because of how fast it's moving and its much wider turning radius, the actual minimum safety altitude for this specific maneuver at Gimhae was 1,100 feet. That is a 400-foot buffer of safety that was just completely unrealized by both the crew and the air traffic controllers. And that missing altitude buffer was absolutely critical, mainly because of Gimhae's pretty perilous local geography. The airport itself sits on low ground right near the sea, but immediately to the north, the terrain rises super aggressively into this chain of forested hills and mountains. Now during the spring, those southern winds push moisture right up these hills, completely wrapping them in thick mist and rain. And to make matters worse, Air China pilots hadn't received any special simulator training for this specific mountainous terrain. Literally, their only circling approach practice was over the totally flat ground back in Beijing. Now, it's really important to note that Captain Wu wasn't blind to this at all. He correctly identified the central danger right away. Looking down at his charts, he actually uttered this pretty stark warning, saying, "We won't enlarge the traffic pattern. The mountain is all over that side." so he knew exactly where the threat was. But, as the rain started pounding on the windshield and their workload just absolutely skyrocketed, the safety briefing they ended up doing was incredibly rushed. It was incomplete, and vital details were just missed. So this is the crucial point, how the whole situation began to unravel through this chain reaction of small, almost completely unnoticed mistakes. First up, First Officer Gao disconnected the autopilot to fly manually, but wrestling a heavy jet without clear visual ground references, that caused an immediate massive spike in his physical workload. Because he couldn't clearly see the ground, his first left turn was way too shallow. That put them only 1.1 miles from the runway instead of the required 1.7 miles. And on top of the shallow turn, they were flying 15 knots faster than the procedure dictated. That extra speed widened their turn radius even more, just eating right through their safety margins. And then there's this number, 190 knots. Remember that 17-knot wind coming from the south that we mentioned earlier? Well, it was out there acting like a giant invisible conveyor belt, just pushing this heavy aircraft from behind. So even though their instruments inside the cockpit showed a totally normal airspeed, their actual speed over the ground had skyrocketed to nearly 190 knots. Basically, they were moving much faster across the Earth than they even realized. Completely overwhelmed by the intense physical demand and this blinding rain, a truly fateful transfer of power happens. First Officer Gao yields, and Captain Wu has to take over the controls. But think about this. Handing over the plane right at the absolute most critical point of the turn, that meant Captain Wu suddenly inherited an approach that was already completely unraveling, and he had absolutely zero time to mentally catch up to what was happening. Let's just walk through the ticking clock of those final 2 minutes because it's chilling. At 11:19 a.m., the aircraft levels out at that incredibly dangerous 700-foot altitude we talked about. Exactly 1 minute later, Captain Wu starts a 20-second timer. The goal here was to perfectly time their final turn back toward the runway. But here's the catch. That timer assumed they were flying at a normal speed. Because of that massive tailwind pushing them at 190 knots, every single passing second on that stopwatch was carrying the heavy jet insanely fast, further and farther north straight into those hidden hills.
And then, right at the exact moment the timer ran out, disaster struck the radios. The tower controller cleared them to land, but he accidentally stated the wrong runway number before quickly correcting himself. Now, in a normal situation, maybe that's fine, but in this incredibly high-stakes moment, that one simple miscommunication caused a fatal hesitation. Captain Wu delayed his turn by 15 absolutely critical seconds. Realizing they were now misaligned, he initially turned slightly left instead of right. That widened their curve even further and officially pushed the massive aircraft 3.3 kilometers completely outside of the protected surveyed airspace.
Down on the ground, radar controllers actually saw them drifting toward the mountains. They tried to issue a warning, but that life-saving alert, it got stepped on by radio static from another transmission. Up in the cockpit, the runway had completely disappeared from view. The first officer pleaded to abort the landing, but it was just too late. A dark shape formed right out of the gray mist, and despite pulling back on the controls with everything he had, the tail of the 767 struck the trees just below the crest of a ridge. They were 4.6 kilometers north of where they were supposed to be. The human toll of this tragedy was just staggering. Out of the 166 souls on board, 129 perished on that mountainside, and that included the first and second officers. Miraculously, though, 37 people actually survived the fire and the wreckage. This was primarily those who were seated in the rear cabin, which managed to absorb the impact just slightly better. And incredibly, among the survivors pulled from the shattered remains of the cockpit was Captain Wu. After the crash, when international investigators combed through that shattered forest and analyzed the black boxes, their forensic findings were absolute. The Boeing 767 had zero mechanical failures. None. There were no engine problems, no control faults, no structural weaknesses at all. The aircraft was fully responsive and entirely flyable right up until the very last fraction of a second. So ultimately, it was just the tragic physics of the situation that sealed their fate. Because of that early shallow turn, the crew was way too close to the runway. That meant they needed a very tight final turn just to survive. But that massive tailwind forced the heavy jet into this wide, sweeping, inescapable curve right into the terrain. It effectively cut the time they had to recognize the trap and react completely in half. You know, the story of Flight 129 isn't just about a plane crash. It's a really profound lesson in the limits of human cognition. When safety margins evaporate in an instant and your workload just spikes way beyond capacity, even the most highly trained professionals can miss a trap that's hiding in plain sight. So I want to leave you with this thought. In our own high-stakes environments, when the pressure mounts and the data gets muddy, how can we design systems that actually prevent the human mind from missing the obvious? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning what you see.
Thank you for watching The Flight Decoder. Subscribe for more authentic aviation investigations. Like this video, share it, and leave your thoughts.